Вітаю, друзі! Сьогодні в стінах Монреальського університету МакГіл відбувається захід обговорення про сексуальні злочини російських окупантів в Україні. Ця подія передбачає показ короткометражних документальних фільмів про сексуальні насилля російськими окупантами. А після перегляду – експертна дискусія науковців. Також відбулася дискусія щодо терміну «геноцид» в Україні. Три епізоди документального фільму, створені молодіжним центром Атлантичної ради України, перекладені англійською мовою з метою розкрити світові історії та свідчення гвалтувань, скоєних російськими окупантами, і наруга над українцями від дитячого віку до похилого. Фільм піднімає тему насильства як зброю у війні проти цивільних людей, залякування, підкорення і, відповідно, винищення українців як нації. Автори стрічки підкреслюють, що в Україні відбувається геноцид і порівнюють його з геноцидом в Руанді та Боснійській війні. У фільмі висловлювалися експерти з права, психології та мілітарної сфери. Квебекська політикиня Поль Робітай в травні минулого року вирушила в Україну з метою дослідження злочинів, скоєних російськими солдатами. Зокрема, в українському селищі Катюжанка на Київщині, за її словами, селянам було важко говорити про те, що вони бачили і що вони пережили.
And we gathered evidence, and we went in the field, and we discovered pieces of evidence that linked the crime to a specific unit who belonged to a battalion, and we could slowly make the link from the crime itself to the general on top. So people were talking, but what was really hard, and I was there only 10 days, was to make people talk about their experience as victims, because among them, some of them were tortured. Maybe some women were raped, I don't know. But before getting there, it takes a lot of time. So I went with the first team, and then the team went back in July, and then were able to talk to victims of torture. And you would say, and we were not the only one in Ukraine, you know. I mean, there's so many NGOs right now doing these fact-finding missions. There's also the General Prosecutor's Office that is doing a lot of work gathering evidence. Foreign specialists, criminal crime units from Canada, from the Netherlands, also working over there. So a lot of evidence is being gathered right now. It's probably the country in the world that is the war in the world that is the most covered in history. But so I mean, you would think, we gather all this evidence, we bring up all these things that will ultimately, hopefully, end up at the International Criminal Court. There are also trials in Ukraine, but before we get to the International Criminal Court, and before these people who committed these crimes will be trialed, it will take time. So that's why movies, documentaries like we saw this evening are important. The reports that are written by these NGOs are important. Because it would be sad to see a population that would be numb seeing violence after violence on TV. It's very important that NGOs and the people in the field bring up these crimes and make people aware of what's going on.
Арт-терапевт Іра Полак-Вероно розповідає про роботу з українськими біженцями в Молдові на початку війни та в Монреалі протягом останніх місяців.
The organization that I joined, Israel, created a tent where kids and their families could rest, could take some pause before moving on. And we've seen how how this space was so well received and so important for children and for their families. Some pictures show them playing or drawing or just sleeping, just resting. And so using the same model, the organization opened spaces in Kishinev, where many of the refugees found temporary homes. And when I arrived there, I've seen that there is great work happening with the children. But while their mothers are waiting around, so we started having conversation with their mothers and seeing the great need for mental health support. And slowly they started to open up. And I remember this one time that I arrived, and it was session that was just didn't plan, but we all sit together and they hold hands, and one by one they started telling us how they left on the 24th of February, 25th of February of 2022. One by one they opened up and say, I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to open up. I think I need to forget about it, but I just cannot anymore. And I think that's one session that really made me realize how important it is for them, first of all, to have the support for children, and then when they see the children are safe, they can actually find a safe space to open up, to talk about things, to talk about issues that they experience right now. Many of them were sharing how difficult it is. They raged, they tired, they have no jobs, no money, no perspective. The father is away, so I think that's kind of creating the safe space.
Доцент кафедри психології університету МакГіл Нейт Фукс говорить, що ключовим компонентом програми, яку пропонує Центр клінічної психології імені Вірджинії Дуглас для українських новоприбулих, це надання психологічних послуг українцям, які пережили травму війни, побиття та насилля.
A lot of the trauma work is based on what we call exposure. So we want the survivors to get to the level of mastery of their stories when they can tell their story without re-experiencing the same difficult emotions, thoughts, flashbacks as the ones they did during the moment of being a victim of sexual crimes or of other traumatic events. So on the other hand, quite often the big barrier to doing successful trauma work is getting the survivor to the point where it feels safe to share their narrative, especially in such a culture where there is a lot of still stigma around therapy in general, and even more so around the issues related to being a victim of sexual violence. We heard those narratives repeated a number of times by participants in the video. So the survivor-centered approach takes that pressure off the victims by documenting, recording their narratives and not having them to retell their stories. On the other hand, in our type of work, in trauma-informed approach to therapy, we want to be aware of all the possible ways of re-traumatizing clients. So, for example, on one hand, we do not get to the point of having to retell the story till later on in treatment.
Марія Попова, доцент кафедри політології в університеті МакГіл, наголосила на проблемі таборів, створених росіянами на території України, де українці стають об'єктом сексуальних знущань.
Locus of the perpetration of sexual violence was in the detention facilities that were operated in Bosnia, and that's what we see happening today in Ukraine as well. So what I wanted to emphasize here is that the filtration camps, you may have heard this term mentioned, that have been set up systematically by the Russian state in Ukraine, are basically places where almost everyone, by definition, who goes through this process is a subject and a victim of sexual violence, because as you saw in the definition, forced nudity is included, and that is literally what every single one of the thousands of Ukrainians who have gone through this filtration process have gone through. And the second point related to this is you may have also noticed in the documentary there was a sort of passing reference to the basement. And these are these torture chambers, basically, that the Russian state set up not only this year, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but throughout the 8 years of aggression by Russia in Ukraine. And these are these detention facilities which are not, which are set up systematically, but of course they have no basis in law, where people are detained, tortured, and very often sexually assaulted as well. And the reason I want to emphasize this is that we have to be aware that these facilities, these detention centers, torture chambers, basements, exist throughout the occupied territories.
Фредерік Мегре, професор права університету МакГіл, говорить, що, очевидно, пріоритетом є виявлення підозрюваних і відповідальних, переконавши, що вони притягнуті до відповідальності.
And then one by one they've now sort of said this, gone on the record saying, well, we think this has now reached the stage where we're quite confident to say that it has been used as a weapon of war, so there's nothing accidental. There's a lot of reports, and we're looking at things like the systematicity, the sense of entitlement. So I think and this is just the way things are done, and the lack of reaction from commanders in the field. Sometimes the objective encouragement. So
Також він висловив думку про те, що не можна судити про винищення етносу тільки по епізодах, де кілька п'яних солдатів скоїли гвалтування. І за його словами, коли військові захищають свою територію і вмирають, то є не геноцид, то є війна. Тобто ідея, що на його погляд наразі не можна говорити, що в Україні відбувається геноцид.
Everyone agrees that what's happening is absolutely horrendous. It's a big debate on genocide. I mean, I think, it's a debate we're having in Canada as well. So is genocide, is the model of the Holocaust?
Але послухаємо, як реагують присутні в залі.
Genocide. I mean, kidnapping children and taking them back into Russia is a clear sign to me also of genocidal objectives. They want to wipe out the Ukrainian culture, the language, the people, I think.
And even in the very first days of war, there was a lot of points, strategic points that were targeted that absolutely had no military power, right? So it's not just the civil sector, it was universities, national monuments kind of dedicated to all kinds of historical Ukrainian national heroes, museums, schools, Ukrainian universities.
The Prime Minister of Canada recognized it was a genocide ongoing. And my understanding is there is an obligation when a genocide is ongoing to do something about it. Is Canada now and other nations that recognize there is a genocide, are they acting as they should by, I don't know what kind of, if there was a treaty formal obligation, but is it happening or not? And can they be recognized accountable later on for not acting as they should have?
I think we probably shouldn't make too much of these obligations under international. They're very broad and vague. So there's this a bit of a myth that if it's now genocide, then that triggers all these very specific and strong obligations. I mean, the obligations are there from the get-go under war crimes, like the Geneva Conventions, crimes against humanity, and states need to do as much as possible, but there are limitations to what they can do, and so there's always a bit of a dialectic of needs and ends, and there's.
Dr. Megre, should we conclude a conflict is a genocide?
When it is a genocide.
No, but let him answer.
No, I mean, I think the intent to destroy the group as such, right, is clearly the threshold.
Yeah, I'm a lawyer, and I like to call a spade a spade. So when a genocide is being committed and you say, with all due respect, that another crime is just as bad or is just as close to that, would be like watching this film and saying, why call it rape? Why not just say that some women were slightly abused, which is almost as bad as what we called in the film rape. Whereas when I look at something that's being committed, and then I look at the Genocide Convention, it's extremely clear. The Genocide Convention says that a genocide is when you use an act to destroy in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group by killing members of the group. We deliberately have seen that. We've seen scenes, including on a theater on which there was a sign saying children being attacked with a missile. That's clearly an intent to kill members of the group. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, just watch that film. That's exactly what we've seen. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction whole and part. When you destroy in the middle of the winter and you tactically destroy in order to ensure that people are living in conditions that are unbearable, that's exactly what deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, there are recorded evidence to the effect that some Russian soldiers were saying that they were raping the women, and when they were asked why are they raping these women repeatedly, they were saying that they are raping them to the point that that woman will never want to have intercourse again and will not bring to this world Ukrainian children. That is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group when you're doing it with that intent. And fifth, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. When you transfer forcibly over 16,000 children to Russia, you're clearly within that definition. So I would respectfully ask you not to minimize by saying we can certainly find something lesser than what it actually is. It is clearly a genocide. Canada has recognized it as a genocide by unanimous resolution of the Parliament of Canada on April 27. The President of the United States said it very clearly on April 12th when he said it's a genocide, and then later on when he was asked, why are you calling it genocide? He said, the evidence is clearer and clearer that the intent of even being Ukrainian is being destroyed. And I think that when you say that it's not very clear what is the obligation, I mean, this looks pretty simple to me. When you say, there's one article that clearly defines the obligation. And the article seems to me like very clear in English. The contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law, which they undertake. What do they undertake? To prevent and to punish. Now, you're going to tell me that everything has been done in 2022 to prevent that genocide from being ongoing? Well, I'll tell you that I've said that on Friday at another event, that a retired US general has qualified the help that NATO member countries have given to Ukraine over 2022 as follows. He said, we certainly have helped, and nobody's denying it, and Ukraine has very often thanked for that help. But he qualified the help as being essentially as follows. To the urgent requests of the Ukrainian government to help it, including to impose a no-fly zone right from the get-go. So my response to you is, let's call a spade, a genocide, and let's not try to over-analyze that section and ask ourselves in conscience, have we done everything that we can? And I'm saying to you respectfully that Ukraine has not asked for Canadians to come and fight on Ukrainian soil, but Ukrainians have asked that the necessary weapons be given to Ukrainians immediately in order for Ukrainians to be able to ensure that they can impose a no-fly zone. And had that been done from the get-go, we would not be seeing at the end of the year damages to the extent that surpassed $700 billion US.
Sexual violence in a conflict is a war crime, and its disclosure does not necessarily require a victim's testimony or a forensic examination. The occupied territory may be liberated later, so the forensic examination will not give any results. This is why eyewitness testimony is so important. Already after 4 months of the war, such countries as Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Canada, Poland, Lithuania, the Czech Republic and Ireland recognize the actions of the Russian Federation in Ukraine as genocide. A special feature of genocide, which distinguishes it from other international crimes, is the intention to destroy, in whole or in part, any national, ethnic, racial or religious group. For the 8th year in a row, together with the Ukrainians, we, the indigenous people, suffer. I am a representative of the Crimean Tatars, and we have been reconstructing our identity in Ukraine for years, and today it is under threat.